Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's Sam and in this video I'm going to show you how to paint the seascape. The seascape will feature a breaking wave, some choppy water in the foreground, some rocks and some atmospheric evening light. I'm going to be covering quite a bit of information, so check out the links below for the written tutorial that accompanies this video, which is available from my website. I hope you enjoy this video. I've come here to the island of Guernsey to a bay called Port Soif. The island is located in the English Channel and is frequently exposed to wild Atlantic weather that whips up heavy swells resulting in rough sea conditions. Combined with light, this creates a perfect place for gathering photo reference for seascape paintings. Having gathered my photo reference, I sit down with my sketchbook and plan a composition. I start with a few thumbnail sketches and then a final pencil drawing which I can then work from when I begin the painting. Before we begin the painting, I'm going to take a moment to explain my colour palette which I use for seascape paintings. I'm using Langridge handmade oils. These paints are beautiful to work with great handling qualities and high saturation of colour. The colours I use to paint seascapes include the following: titanium white, cadmium yellow deep, yellow oxide, burnt sienna, burnt umber, cadmium red light, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, and phthalo green. And I order my colours on my palette for ease of use. Now to begin the painting. I am working on a 30cm by 40cm canvas, and I've pre-prepared it with a layer of burnt umber which helps to warm up the painting as it comes through the paint layers. I start sketching out my painting with burnt umber mixed with liquid to form a series of lines and shapes. Beginning with the sky, I apply titanium white to form the highlights of the clouds. This will then mix in with the shadows of the clouds, which I'm fine with as I know I'll be returning to the sky later on as the painting progresses. I mix the blue of the sky with cobalt blue, cobalt teal, a little ultramarine blue and titanium white. And for the shadows of the clouds, I'm using ultramarine blue, burnt umber, a little quinacridone magenta and titanium white. These are my sky and land colours which I will use throughout the painting. Moving on to the rocks in the background, I use my cloud covers to paint in the rock forms. Next, I form the horizon of the sea. I don't want it to come too far forward in the painting, so I'm using a desaturated blue, which I mix using ultramarine blue with burnt umber and titanium white. Once the background is established, I begin working on the breaking wave, starting with the translucent water, which I mix with a combination of cobalt teal, phthalo green and titanium white. And for the main body of the wave, I start adding ultramarine blue and cobalt blue to the mix, reducing the amount of titanium white to darken the hue as it approaches the trough of the wave. Next, I start blocking in the highlights of the waves and the white water in the foreground. I'm not worried at this stage that the titanium white is tonally too light, as it will soon mix in with the shadow colours that I'm going to introduce shortly. Next, I form the shadows of the breaking wave and white water. I've used the same colour combinations I used in the wave, but for the other areas of the foamy water, I've used more ultramarine blue and cobalt blue. Having completed the water, for now, I turn my attention to the rocks. I mix the colour of the mid-ground rock on the right using the same colours I used for the clouds. However, I add a little titanium white to the mix to make it tonally a little lighter and to make it recede from the rocks in the foreground. My shadows will be at their darkest in the foreground. I mix ultramarine blue and burnt umber, which creates a near black. I then paint the sunlit face of the rock by mixing titanium white and burnt umber. As I work on the main area of the rocks in the foreground, I mark zones of white paint to form areas where the reflected sunlight at the edge of the cracks will show. To complete the blocking in process, I paint the main body of the rocks using a varying amount of burnt umber, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, quinacridone magenta and titanium white. Now that the blocking in process is complete, I allow my painting to dry. I'm not worried about detail at this stage. The blocking in process merely serves as a map of where I'll work on the painting as I start building up the detail. Now that my painting is dry, I make a start on building up the detail. I go back to the sky and using my sky mix colours, I start to define the shape of the clouds. Using a flat bristle brush, I establish the cloud highlights. The cloud highlights appear white, but I have in fact dropped the tone by mixing in a small amount of burnt umber, ultramarine blue and quinacridone magenta. I don't want the clouds to come too far forward in the painting, but I need to keep the sky tonally lighter than the sea and the rocks. Going back to the sea, I start adding more detail in the crest of the breaking waves and the white water in the foreground. As with the cloud highlights, at this stage I don't want to use pure titanium white, so I reduce the tone by mixing in a small amount of burnt umber, ultramarine blue and quinacridone magenta. I want to save my lightest tones until the very end of the painting, as this will give the wave action of the sea a more three-dimensional effect. Now you may have noticed in the video so far that I've been using a lot of the same colours in the sky, the rocks, the sea, and mostly ultramarine blue, burnt umber, quinacridone magenta and titanium white. This is actually a good thing, because the painting becomes more harmonious precisely because there's common colours contained throughout the painting. Once the highlights in the water are established, I turn my attention to the areas of the water that are in shadow. I'm mostly using varying amounts of ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, and in other places I'm using quinacridone magenta and titanium white, which I'm adding to the mixture. With a dagger brush, I introduce some foam patterns into the breaking wave. Here I'm starting to build up the detail of the rocks in the foreground, and I'm using a dagger brush as I re-establish the rock shapes. Given that these rocks are in the foreground and closest to the viewer, I can use my full tonal range of colours where my shadows are darkest and my highlights are at their lightest. I re-establish the lighter tones on the sunward edges of the rock cracks. I also want to give the illusion of wet rocks, so I mix a little cobalt blue and titanium white. Continuing to work on the rocks, I add more highlights to the crack edges, where the sun is directly reflecting the light. I also reinforce the cracks and the shadows of the rocks using a dagger brush. After spending much time adjusting the colour and tone, and shaping and refining the various forms within the painting, I can now see the end in sight. Turning our attention to the distant rocks, I wanted to create the illusion of the bright evening sun before it begins to set, illuminating the back of the rocks and the sea. Using a flat bristle brush, I apply a glaze of yellow oxide mixed with a little quinacridone magenta and titanium white, which I dry brush onto the canvas. Continuing to refine the rocks in the foreground, I add a little more cobalt blue mixed with titanium white to the surface of the rocks to reinforce the illusion of a wet surface. I then add more details to the clouds, applying lighter tone and refining the overall forms. Using a small filbert brush, I apply pure titanium white to the rock edges to give the appearance of the sun reflecting off a wet surface. Finally, I add my lightest tones in the splashes of the white water and the breaking wave using pure titanium white. Using a small round brush, I add a few sparkles in the water, and again I'm using pure titanium white. And with that, the painting is now complete. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found the information in this video useful. If you have any questions regarding painting seascapes or anything art related, please leave them in the comments section below and I'll be happy to try and answer them as best I can. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and check out the link section below, which also includes a link to the written tutorial that accompanies this video. Thanks again and stay tuned for the next video, which will be coming soon.